After the First Civil War, Parliament entered negotiations with Charles to try and find a peace settlement to try and end all the divisions and all the conflict between all the nations. However, Charles tried to use these negotiations to play and exacerbate the divisions between the different nations and within England itself. During the First Civil War, Parliament was divided between the War Party and the Peace Party in how they wanted to fight the war. The Peace Party wanted to reach a settlement as soon as possible to end the conflict, and they were willing to have more lenience in negotiations with Charles, whereas the War Party was stricter in sticking to the 19 propositions. While they did want a negotiation as well to reach a settlement, they were much more focused and dedicated to curtailing the king's power than the Peace Party. Before the death of Pym in December 1643, he managed to keep Parliament united by ensuring for peace while simultaneously creating the instruments to fight the war, so he could usually get both parties on his side. For example, Pym persuaded Parliament to accept the Solemn League and Covenant in August of 1643, which was very helpful in tying up Royalist forces in the north. So after the death of Pym, the divisions between the War Party and the Peace Party eventually developed at the end of the war to the political Presbyterians, who came from the Peace Party, and the political Independents, who mostly came from the War Party. One of the main points of contention was the Solemn League and Covenant. Before 1644, you had the War Party who supported the agreement because they believed that'd be the best way to fight the war, as the Scots would provide 21,000 soldiers under the command of Alexander Leslie. However, the Peace Party didn't like the alliance because they thought it was going to extend the war. The Solemn League of Covenant was an agreement between Scotland and England that the Scottish would help England in the war in return for establishing Presbyterianism in the country for 3 years, which was beneficial to England because, Parliament would win the war, and beneficial to the Scots because they could secure their position with the Bishop Wars. That's mostly conflicts between Laudianism, which Charles was trying to impose, and the Presbyterian Scots from the Kirk. However, after the Battle of Marston Moor, the political independents realised they could probably win the war without the Scots' help, so they didn't like the Solemn League of Covenant because they didn't like the authoritarianism of the Scottish Kirk and believed the Covenant threatened their religious independence. However, the political Presbyterians begin to like the Solemn League and Covenant because they believed it's the fastest way to end the war, thus get peace. The political Presbyterians favoured a Presbyterian-style church which attendance was compulsory to avoid religious anarchy. This theme of trying to enforce order can also be seen with them discouraging promotion from lower ranks because they believe that would disrupt the order of society. As the political independents wanted a wide range of religious liberties so that all Protestants could have freedom of conscience. This more individualistic approach can also be seen in their promotion for the lower ranks, where it's more meritocratic, and, as you can see with the New Model Army later on, gave more liberties and more power to lower ranking officers. It's almost like both sides were influenced by the Jacobean consensus of the Via Media, with the political Presbyterians wanting their religious policy to try and issue for peace and have less conflict, and the political independents wanting a wider range of religious freedoms. The political Presbyterians believe that having a Presbyterian church would allow a consolidation of the alliance with Scotland and possibly even lead to union, whereas the political independents thought they were good allies and they appreciated them and all, but they didn't want to dictate the terms of which they should settle their kingdom from Scotland. They wanted to decide their own fate. Think of the Presbyterians as being authoritarians and think of the independents as being libertarians. Presbyterians favoured order and they were willing to give up some of their freedoms for that order, whereas the independents, they valued freedom, even if it's not going to lead to a consensus in the country. However, by 1646, the political Presbyterians were the most influential group in Parliament, and they were seen to be led by Holles. So why were the political Presbyterians the most successful group in Parliament? First of all, they were elected by the political nation, and with the February Assessment Ordinance and the May Compulsory Loans Ordinance, they were going to be hard beaten by taxes, and they didn't really like that. But more importantly, everyone in society really, they're just tired of war. So we have the political Presbyterians who were focusing more on peace rather than trying to get a better settlement. They're going to be more popular. However, the New Model Army predominantly supported the political independents. But who actually were the New Model Army? Well, the New Model Army were Puritan zealots, basically. The officers were very devout. They used religious iconography when going into battle. They had chaplains appointed to a regiment, and they were close to the colonel, and they gave sermons. There's individual Bible studies, they did lay preaching, they did fasting and self-reflection before to take on any major task. However, one vital aspect of the religious They had beliefs in equality, that everyone was favoured by the Lord, and this could be seen quite prominently in their support of meritocracy and giving power to lower ranking officers and not treating them as rigid social lines. So with the political Presbyterians established firmly in Parliament, how did they try and pursue peace with Charles? Well, in July 1646 they issued the Newcastle Propositions. Firstly, it established Presbyterianism in England for 3 years. This would satisfy the Solemn League and Covenant and would improve foreign relations with Scotland, possibly even leading to union, considering one of the big problems with James I trying to get union was which religious system would be used. Because religion was highly important to both nations, neither wanted to make concessions on that. However, this would also anger the political independents who didn't really want Presbyterianism. Parliament was to control the army for 20 years, which was deemed the remaining lifespan of Charles. It occurred to curtail Charles' power whilst not destroying the prerogative power, so you might be more lenient into that. However, with Parliament controlling the army, that would take power away from the New Model Army, who didn't like the political Presbyterians, so they weren't going to be happy with them controlling the army. Also, only 58 royalists wouldn't be pardoned. This would mean Charles would be more likely to accept the Newcastle Propositions. However, Charles had no intention of agreeing to the Newcastle Propositions, but he didn't say this because he wanted to stall so divisions could exacerbate. So of the winter of 1646 to 47, Parliament made even more concessions to Charles to try and get him to accept the peace. This involved demobilising the New Model Army but creating a smaller force to go and crush Irish rebels and creating an alternate, safer army based on London bands. One of the main reasons for trying to demobilise the New Model Army was because Parliament owed them £3 million, whilst royal finances never exceeded sort of £1 million per year. And in 1625, when Charles asked Parliament for £1 million to go and fight Spanish, which Parliament wanted, even then they didn't give him £1 million, never mind £3 million. This all shows how much money this is. Because of the Newcastle Propositions, and specifically the further concessions made over the winter of 1646 to 1647, that's when the New Model Army became a political body. Whilst as political independents they did disagree with the concessions made to Charles, they also had more immediate concerns, being faced with disbandment with only 8 weeks of arrears pay rather than the £3 million owed. Also, Parliament failed to pass an Indemnity Act, which means the soldiers in the New Model Army could be charged for crimes during the First Civil War, which means there's a physical fear for their safety. Holles also passed a declaration of dislike, which called the New Model Army enemies of the state and disturbers of the peace, which would anger the soldiers since it had just been an important part of winning the Civil War. In March 1647, the New Model Army petitioned Parliament for a redress of their grievances. However, Parliament just condemned this petition, showing the New Model Army had no political weight yet. In May 1641, Parliament accepted Charles's third reply to the Newcastle Propositions, which would have established Presbyterianism for 3 years, and Charles wouldn't have control of the army for 10 years. And on the 25th of May, the Commons had voted in favour of disbanding the New Model Army for 8 weeks of arrears pay. Now, all of this radicalised the New Model Army. They thought Parliament was too lenient on Charles because the only way to guarantee the tyranny of the personal rule couldn't be reenacted again was to destroy the instruments of power, because they believed Charles couldn't be trusted. Like 1628's Petition of Rights, he just got out of that. The incident in Scotland, the 3rd of May army plot, they just didn't trust Charles to behave responsible with power, so they needed to cut the power. And because they're going to be dissolved without an Indemnity Act, and without the financial recompensation they were owed, they want a guarantee of their safety, and to get what they were owed. And since they were about to be disbanded, they didn't really have anything left to lose. So in June, Fairfax called a general meeting at Newmarket, where the General Council of the Army was formed. It was technically led by Fairfax, but mostly dominated by Cromwell and Ireton, and it was there to lead the army to a settlement. The council was formed out of 2 commissioned officers of each regiment and 2 adjutators of each regiment. Adjutators were men and junior officers who were political, and their inclusion in the council shows the New Model Army belief that everyone is valued by God and their meritocratic leanings. However, by giving junior officers more power, it leads to more problems where the junior officers went against the New Model Army's settlement with Charles. Also, the creation of the General Council of the Army shows the formalisation of the New Model Army's political leanings. Then, on the 2nd of June, Cornet Joyce, who was a member of the New Model Army, just stole Charles. This was significant for the New World Army because now they had real political weight. They had the strongest military in the land and they controlled the king. This made the New World Army essential to any settlement with the king and allowed direct negotiations between the New World Army and Charles. Additionally, a cornet was the lowest ranking officer in the New World Army, so the fact that the lowest ranking officer just stole the king, who was supposed to be appointed by God, shows how the rank and file didn't adhere to the traditional ideas of social structure, and that some of the rank and file didn't even respect the king at this point, at all. On the 4th of June, the New World Army produced a humble remonstrance. It said the New World Army would not dissolve until its grievances were met, such as removing Halsey's Presbyterian faction from Parliament and granting an act of indemnity. Indemnity would guarantee the New World Army's physical safety, and considering Halsey had called them traitors to the state after the stunt of stealing Charles, it's likely the New World Army would be in danger if Hull still remained dominant in Parliament. Although more importantly, a Parliament dominated by political independence would strive for harsher measures put on Charles. With this, the New World Army started a slow march to London to put pressure on Parliament and to force them to act, and on the 5th of June presented Parliament with a solemn engagement which was written by Ireton. To reinforce the solemn engagement, impeachment charges were written against 11 MPs including Hull's on the 7th of June. However, considering they're trying to impeach elected MPs, it's not as strong as trying to impeach Wentworth, who was accused of trying to be an army to use against Parliament and tried to set up absolutist governance. Also on the 7th of June, Cromwell, Fairfax and Ireton went to Chaldely to start negotiations with Charles, although these were mostly headed by Ireton. On the 14th of June, a representation of the army was created, mostly by Lambert and Ireton, but Cromwell also assisted. It sent out the fundamental ideas of the New World Army's political position. First of all, it wanted future parliaments with fixed duration. This is important because it curtailed the monarch's prerogative to dissolve Parliament whenever it wanted. It also follows along the lines of the previous Triennial Act, which wanted parliaments to be held every 3 years for at least 50 days. It guaranteed the right of citizens to petition Parliament, which would have increased democracy and made Parliament more accountable. Also probably influenced by how Parliament just pushed aside the New World Army's petition in March. It wanted a purge of Parliament, just to get rid of Hull's Presbyterians, and with an extension of religious freedoms, which is in line with the political independence view on religion. On the 16th of July, there was another meeting of the General Council at Reading. Here, the heads of the proposals, which Ireton had written after negotiations with Charles, was presented. However, this is where the representation and power of the agitators became a problem, because they saw Ireton and Cromwell and the heads overall as moderate, and they didn't like that. They accused Ireton and Cromwell of being hypocrites, and they called to just march on London to get their aims. The idea that all are valued by God was now causing greater problems within the General Council, because the agitators were given power. So what was in the heads of the proposals? First of all, they wanted biennial parliaments, which is just an extension of the Triennial Act to be every 2 years instead of every 3 years. They wanted a reform of parliamentary representation, parliamentary control of the army and the navy, curtailing Charles's prerogative of being commander-in-chief. They wanted Parliament to control appointment to the great offices for 10 years, which is in a form an extension of the 10 propositions where they'd merely get the right to veto appointment to the Privy Council. However, it's only for 10 years, so it's temporary. They would maintain a national church with bishops and episcopacy, however they'd have no coercive power. So trying to maintain order while still ensuring religious freedoms. I would pass an Act of Oblivion, which meant only a few royalists weren't pardoned, which means Charles was more likely to accept it. It seems a bit odd that the New World Army supported Parliament, as in, having the army and the navy, while simultaneously being in a power struggle with them. However, the New World Army wasn't against Parliament, they were just against the political Presbyterians. And also by giving concessions to Parliament, they'd probably get more MPs on their side, which would counteract the power of the political Presbyterians. However, vastly more important was to restrain the power of Charles and the monarchy, to prevent the tyranny of the personal rule from ever happening again. How influential was Charles on the heads of proposals? Berkeley, who was Charles' emissary, on the 3rd of July noted that Ireton negotiated with Charles up until midnight from dinner, and that having close negotiations allowed the New World Army to be more influenced by Charles. Although it's unlikely that Charles himself was that charismatic, considering he was shy, had a speech defect, and at the start of 1628 Parliament he allowed John Cook to speak for him, which had better relations with Parliament, and he failed to unite his generals and his politicians during the First Civil War. Berkeley also commented on the divisions widening due to Ireton and Cromwell negotiating with Charles, stating that he thought the army would turn against him if he didn't accept the proposals. On the 26th of July, on the Covenants of Hulls, the London crowd stormed into the Commons and forced through a resolution inviting Charles back to London. Although hopefully Hull didn't miss the irony of a political Presbyterian who was more socially and politically conservative and favoured order, and that's why they wanted the Presbyterian Church, using the London crowd, which was deemed as a threat to social order when Pym started using it. This possibly shows an increasing desperation in trying to stop the New Model Army from advancing on London, also shown by the peace demonstrations held in London. However, by the 3rd of August, the New Model Army reached the outsides of London when they were joined by the political independents who had ran from Parliament. By the 6th of August, they reached Westminster, which is where most of their political power was, and by the 8th they reached the City of London, where a lot of financial power was. However, in November of 1647, Charles escaped Hampton Court and went to Scotland, and started negotiations with the Scots on the 11th of November. In the engagement of December 1647, Charles had agreed to establishing 3 years of Presbyterianism if Scotland helped him get back to power. Due to the Bishop Wars and the First Civil War, the Scottish were not fond of Charles at all, so this proved deeply divisive. The Duke of Hamilton persuaded the Scottish Parliament to this view, because they thought it was the best way to secure Scottish position with England. However, the Kirk condemned the engagement, and Alexander Leslie condemned the engagement, and he was the military leader of the Bishop Wars and the First Civil War. This meant that the army would be led by the Duke of Hamilton, because Leslie refused to attack Parliament, which meant they had a less capable military leader, and the army led into England would be much weaker than the one that Alexander Leslie fought with the First Civil War with. However, before Charles escaped Hampton Court to go to Scotland, Parliament sent in the 4 bills, which was a combination of the heads of the proposals and the Newcastle prepositions, which Charles didn't respond to till the end of December after the engagement. Charles had hoped that the division sowed between the agitators and the higher ranking officers in the New Model Army, and the divisions between Parliament and the New Model Army, would lead to a fractured opposition. However, his betrayal just led to all the divisions being completely disregarded and Parliament and the New Model Army being against Charles again, which sent in January 1648 of the Vote of No Address, where Parliament just cut communications with Charles. However, he had sown division between the people and Parliament. For example, the people were still annoyed that Parliament kept up its high taxation from its fiscal military state, with the excise tax and the compulsory loan tax possibly seen as an equivalent of ship money, high taxation when it's not really needed or justified. They wanted a religious settlement, and wanted to return to the traditional county governance and the monarch to restore order. Charles thought the people had learned their lesson that they needed a monarch to sustain social order. The situation would have seemed so similar to the court masques that he enjoyed highly. Here England was, with social order being turned over, and here Charles was, the monarch going to come to the land and restore order. Although the court masques were being premeditated for the monarch to actually restore order. Unfortunately, Charles didn't have this privilege. People also hated the New Model Army for being seen as an obstacle to normality. On April 1648, the New Model Army held a Windsor prayer meeting. This was very significant because it was the first time that regicide was debated publicly. Regicide would destroy the entire foundation of the great chain of being that society was built upon. Part of the reason for discussing regicide was because Charles was starting a second civil war, and they believed that God had determined that Charles wasn't meant to rule in the first civil war, so by starting a second civil war, he was questioning God's authority and judgment. This also shows the New Model Army's religious zealousy. During 1648, there was royalist uprisings in South Wales, Kent, East Anglia and Yorkshire. East Anglia is a very important one because in the First Civil War, that was a vital zone for the parliamentarians. While these uprisings threatened to divide the New Model Army, especially with an invasion from the Scottish being imminent, they were also uncoordinated and isolated, so they were much easier to deal with. Cromwell went to South Wales, Fairfax and Ireton went to Kent, and Lambert went up north to slow down the Scottish forces. In July 1648, a large Scottish force met up with 4,000 Northern Royalists. On August 1648, the Battle of Preston ended Charles's ambitions. The Scottish forces were caught strung out along a road from Preston to Wigan, and the disciplined New World army managed to destroy the forces despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. 5,000 Scots were either killed or captured, the Scottish force was disintegrated, and the Duke of Hamilton was later captured and executed. After dealing with the Kent uprising, Fairfax went to Essex to put down that uprising, ending on the 28th of August with the Siege of Colchester, which inflicted heavy losses but led to the end of the war. In October, Cromwell and Lambert went to Edinburgh to make sure that the anti-engagers were in power, who were led by Argyle. Ironically, this led to the English establishing their position with Scotland, whereas the entire point of helping Charles was to establish the Scottish position with England. After the Siege of Colchester from 1648, the New World Army rounded up the Royalist leaders and executed them. This shows an increasing radicalism of the New World Army, which in turn led to more strained relations between the New World Army and Parliament, because they wanted re-enter negotiations again with Charles to try and stop social order being diminished, despite the fact that Charles had just started an entire war against Parliament to avoid a negotiation. After the Second Civil War, the New World Army was convinced that God had condemned Charles for making him lose the second time.